I'm Brian Scordato, and this is the Idea to Startup podcast, a podcast that's been called, quote, easily 10 times more useful than my MBA, which probably says more about higher education than our pod, but it was a nice review. We're going to start sending the pod along with some deeper content each week, so if you're a power listener of Idea to Startup, head to gettacklebox.beehive.com or the link in the show notes. Beehive is spelled a bit wildly, so it's gettacklebox.beehive.com. On to it. Today, we're jumping into part 3 of testing a startup idea live. This is my favorite of the 3 parts so far because it puts us firmly in the scary part of life, what I call the last 15%, the place where things get worse before they get better, the place most people avoid. Nearly everyone is good at the first 85% of life. The last 15%, though, that's the hard stuff. The first 2 episodes of the series talked about things like customer interviews and ideation, which are certainly uncomfortable, but most people can rev themselves up enough to speak with a few dozen strangers. Those live in the first 85%. Today, though, we're talking about Concierge MVPs. This is the last 15%. This is the place where we lose nearly all of our entrepreneurs. It'll be the first time you're actually on the hook for producing something valuable. You're going to try to help someone solve a problem, and ideally, they're going to pay you for it. If they don't get value, they'll see you as the fraud you always knew you were. Kidding, sorta, because that's how most of us think. While there's nothing objectively scary about the individual ingredients of a Concierge MVP, when they are combined, they get intimidating, which is why we'll tease the steps out today so that they're manageable. And it's why I'm trying to do a bunch of Concierge MVP episodes so that you get familiar with an unfamiliar thing. We need to train the fear out of you with repetition. There are a lot of things I envy about my tiny son, but at the very top of the list is how little repetition he needs to remove fear. I assume he'll need more repetition as he gets older, but for now, he's pretty good. We went to the beach in South Carolina for my 40th birthday last week, and it was the first time he'd ever seen the ocean. You'd think this massive, roaring, vast, salty bathtub would scare him, and it did, for about 30 seconds, until he realized it was okay, and then we spent the rest of the trip chasing him up and down the beach like we were in the football scene from Top Gun, or Point Break. Pretty identical scenes, really. I've always been a Keanu guy, so let's say the football scene from Point Break. Anyway, there's something oddly inspiring about a 30-pound kid careening down the beach and in one 30-second span, first trying to catch a seagull, then running directly up to a 90-pound dog that towers over him like a grizzly bear and belting out rough, rough, then flying into the waves only to get knocked on his butt and crack up laughing. At some point, we lose that laugh when we get knocked down energy, but fearless, optimistic energy, get knocked on your butt and laugh energy, is essential for a Concierge MVP. Remember, you're likely going to be 90% wrong about everything you think is true about your startup and your customer and your market. And the goal is to pivot quickly to find the 10% you are right about so we can lean into it, which means we're going to get knocked on our butt a lot and we're going to have to smile. Startups are a race to 5 pivots, and to get to 5 pivots, you got to start with 1. Enough of that. Let's get to it. Let's run a Concierge MVP with our doctor friend. And if you missed the first 2 episodes in the series, feel free to go back and listen to them. But as always, this episode is going to stand on its own. I'll start with a quick update of what you need to know. Last week, I kicked off our update with the Previously on 24 clip, and a few people reached out to say their favorite Previously on show clips. One guy reached out to say that Fargo's, which was apparently erstwhile on Fargo, always bugged him and was, quote, pretentious, just like that stupid show. That really cracked me up. This guy has been holding on to that anger at Fargo's intro for years, just waiting for the right place to release it. Embrace to heal, my friend. So, for you, erstwhile on Idea to Startup. In episode 1, we met our founder. They're a doctor who's become disillusioned by being a doctor. They spend more time in portals responding to messages and inputting information than they do with patients. Plus, their patient load has exploded. They are now shouldering thousands of patients. This doctor said that they, and the majority of doctors they know, are burnt out. They're all considering either leaving medicine or joining a Concierge MD model. So he wanted to build a business that helped them do just that. It would have coaching, community, courses, placement services. It was a smooth path to change your career. We talked through the idea using the 90% wrong principle, then laid out a 4-question story framework to pull out the assumptions we had to test. Finally, we figured out the viability of early customers with a committed versus interested test. The doctor landed on 2 potential customer personas. The first was someone leaving to join a healthcare startup. The second was someone looking to shift to the concierge model. I noted at the end of the first episode that I hated both of these customers. You need a customer that's already committed, not one you have to help commit. But we moved on anyway because most people need to touch a hot stove before they believe you that it's actually hot. Episode 2 was focused on helping this founder find these customers and understand what value he could actually provide for them. We talked through brute force customer acquisition in Delta 4, and our founder did a great job of finding and speaking with all sorts of doctors and learned that the customer he'd chosen stunk. The stove was, in fact, hot. He couldn't find anyone who'd actually left to join a startup, and people leaving for Concierge MD didn't need any help. But through these customer conversations, we learned something else, that a segment of doctors had become obsessed with productivity. They were reading books like Atomic Habits and watching YouTube videos on the Getting Things Done method and learning about Notion and actively trying to become more efficient. Lots of doctors thought this was their path back to career sanity and enjoyment. We also found out that our entrepreneur friend, our doctor, was nuts about the productivity stuff. He was super into it. So, a new hypothesis emerged. We could teach the doctors who really wanted to become more efficient to become more efficient. We could turn the 20 hours of weekly portal outreach into 5. Which brings us to part 3, today. We've got a customer. We think we know the story they're the lead character in. We think we know what success looks like for them, and we think we can help. So, it's time to stop thinking and time to act. It's time to bring reality into the situation. It's time to run a Concierge MVP. And we'll do it after a little smooth jazz. If you've got a startup idea and a full-time job and want to test out the former before you leave the latter, come and work with us. Apply at gettacklebox.com. Over 400 startups have tested and built ideas through our program, and those businesses are now collectively worth over $1 billion. Our program helps you prioritize and execute, and our members and me and the team keep you accountable and give you feedback along the way. Come build with us at gettacklebox.com. The Concierge MVP. A Concierge MVP is the simplest version of your product where you manually solve your customer's problem. I like to picture myself in a butler getup for Concierge MVPs. Tux, white gloves, all of it. There to roll up my sleeves and solve some problems. The point of a Concierge MVP is feedback. It isn't to build a product or to perfect your internal process or to do something you can raise money on, although those might all be side effects. The point is to get as close as possible to your customer while they interact with the problem you're going to solve, to watch them struggle and then help them succeed. To answer the first question that pops into your head, yes, we're going to want customers to pay for this Concierge MVP for 2 reasons. First, the only way to get honest feedback is to have a customer pay. If we aren't helpful, we want them to be pissed. If the service was free, they're not going to be. And second, we want to start understanding how much a customer will pay to have this problem removed from their plate. And that is always the way to frame it. People do not pay to buy their way into something. People pay to buy their way out of something. And we need to understand the value of the hassle we're freeing them from. Your instincts will be to give away the Concierge MVP for free, but that's just your lizard brain talking. Putting yourself on the hook with a price tag is uncomfortable, so you should lean into it. There are a few core ingredients for running a Concierge MVP. First, we need to define our Frank. This is a representation of our best customer, who we're building the test for. The name Frank will make more sense later. But like any good experiment, we need to be precise. If you have a few different types of customers you'd like to test, do them separately. Specificity is going to be important here. Second, we need to find these customers and build trust with them. We need to describe the specific problem they have and exactly what their life would look like if that problem were gone. Third, we need a wedge, a smaller piece of that big success we described. This will ideally convert the customers we find in step 2. And finally, we need to execute the actual test to build our concierge product with a huge focus on the feedback loop. We need extreme visibility with our customer. The first 3 ingredients are the hardest. If you nail them, the solving part, the actual product concierge part, is nearly always straightforward, though I know you're going to be skeptical and not believe me about that. So we've got to find customers, build trust with them through specifics, promise to solve a subset of a big problem, and keep that promise. Let's bring our doctor friend back into the mix and get it done. Ingredient number 1, pick your Frank. Step 1 of a Concierge MVP is defining who exactly you want to target for your test. When you're targeting customers for the MVP, you want to target the people that already believe what you believe, the ones on mile 25 of the marathon who just need a little push to finish. Your job isn't motivating or convincing, it's guiding a ship that's already left the port. That's a lot of metaphors, so I'll throw one more at you that I've used 1,000 times on the pod, and I'll use 1,000 times more because it's that important. For your first customer, you don't want to convince someone to leave their apartment to get a nice coffee. You want to intercept someone who already left their apartment because they wanted a nice coffee and they're on their way to get one, and then you offer them something better. We target pros, not amateurs. Also, again, our persona is based on a real person. At Tacklebox, we always call this person Frank. This started back in 2015 during Cohort 1, where a founder had an actual perfect customer who happened to be named Frank, and they wouldn't shut up about it. They'd constantly say, Frank would love this, Frank would love that, and it stuck. Your Frank is a real person who exists, someone you've spoken with, someone you understand deeply, someone you are sure that if they don't want the thing you're building, no one will. If you ever speak with a Tacklebox alum, they're going to ask you about your Frank, so be ready. I had our doctor pick the best potential customer they'd spoken with and then use that person to create the initial persona they'd target with 3 questions. First, what problem are they trying to solve? Second, what have they done to try and solve it already? And third, what would wild success look like? Here is how our doctor answered. His Frank happened to be a doctor friend named James. And James was frustrated and dismayed with the amount of time he spent answering portal emails. He'd recently had a big bump in patients due to other doctors in his practice leaving after a private equity firm bought the hospital he worked at. He was overwhelmed. To try to solve this problem in the past, he'd watched YouTube videos on productivity and read Atomic Habits, and he'd tried to implement simple batching and time blocking to move through the portal quicker, but he hadn't seen results. Wild success for him would be cutting portal time down significantly, but he had a tough time defining exactly what that would look like. Right now, he said he probably spent 20 hours a week in the portal, and success would be anything less than that. Everything in the test now keys off of this persona. We've defined our Frank. Step 2 then is to try and find some more Franks so that we can run a Concierge MVP with a handful of customers. Ingredient 2, find and convince some Franks. Our doctor friend didn't actually need too much help finding customers for his Concierge MVP because he'd already gone to coffee shops next to hospitals in the morning and chatted up doctors. He also is a doctor, so he's got a bunch of doctor friends he could reach out to. Ideally, by the Concierge MVP, you aren't doing a ton of cold customer acquisition, though it isn't the end of the world if you are. It makes the test more authentic and will obviously need to get cold customers eventually. But even if you do have people who might be interested, you're likely going to need to build more trust with them before they decide to fork over their hard-earned money. And the way to build trust is specificity. Lots and lots of specificity. I'm reading a book on Russian literature as I'm figuring out how to write a novel, which is probably the most 40-year-old person I've said to this point, and there's a part in the book dissecting Chekhov's writing that stands out. He writes in a way that constantly reinforces the feeling he wants to create. He drums the reader over the head with it. So when he describes a tavern he wants to seem bleak, in one paragraph he weaves in that it's dung-strewn, noisy, smelly, loud, banging, and a few other negative words all crammed into like 3 sentences. And you feel it as a reader. There's no confusion. That is the way we want our messaging to be. Chekhov-like. Not subtle or clever. Obvious and specific and hitting our customer over the head. There are a bunch of potential flows here. You might be sending cold emails or showing up physically in a place to speak to your customer or maybe getting on a call with them, but the core theory is the same. Specificity about where your customer is and where they'd like to be. Current problem and wild success, all geared towards our Frank. Our doctor friend wanted to send an email to a group of 10 doctors he thought might be interested, and he wanted to build out a landing page so that the business felt a bit more substantive. I love a landing page at this stage, and I'll link to the one person landing page episode in the show notes if you want more detail on how to build one out. The cliff notes are to make a landing page that speaks directly to our Frank, almost as if we were writing them a direct email trying to convince them that we can help them solve their problem. It should feel too specific. You should be uncomfortable with the amount of detail. That is when you know you're ready. Here is how our doctor's page turned out. The H1, or the main header on the page, read, quote, "You became a doctor to help people, but now you spend more time in the portal than with your patients." The H2, or subheader, read, "We help you build productivity systems that'll cut your portal time in half." Then there was a paragraph below that leaned into the checkoff thing. Quote, "You've watched productivity videos on YouTube, you've read James Clear, you've learned about getting things done in Para, and you have a Notion template at home. You've tried to implement time blocking and batching at work, but it's hard to translate. What works at a consulting firm doesn't work in the medical field. We are productivity experts who are also doctors. We'll help you build productivity systems within the boundaries of a hospital. We've spoken with doctors frustrated enough to leave the field, but we know that that is not what you want. You want to help people. We'll give you the time and mental space back to do it." Then there's a call to action, which will be the thing we're actually selling. That is part 3, the wedge, which we'll get to in a second. But first, I want to briefly talk about champions. Because a huge part of any great landing page is the risk section, and a huge part of any successful concierge MVP is a champion. Humans are not apex predators. Evolutionarily, if that's a word, I think it is, we are squirrels, foragers with predators. When we see something new, our first instinct is to find the risk in it. And that is a critical part of your landing page, predicting the initial risk that'll pop up in your customer's mind and assuaging it immediately. The best way to find that risk is to have a perfect customer, a Frank, point it out. That means we need someone on the inside, a champion. Our doctor's Frank, the guy he's basing his persona on, who's actually named James, is a close friend and happy to help with the product. He's a champion. So after drafting up the landing page, our doctor got on a Zoom call with James to show it to him and get his reaction in real time. After a few seconds, he asked James the key question: "Why wouldn't you do this?" Basically, what's the risk? James thought for a split second and responded, quote, "Two things. First, do I need to implement this with my whole team? Because that would be a nightmare. And second, is it compatible with all the medical software and HIPAA and all that?" Great. This now allows us to tweak the landing page and add the risk in. Our H2 now reads, quote, "We help you build productivity systems that'll cut your portal time in half. We are HIPAA compliant, don't require any integration with hospital software, and don't require you to get your team involved. We call out the risk, and it isn't a risk anymore. Champions are worth their weight in gold." On to part 3, the wedge. Ingredient 3, the wedge. Now that we've got a landing page that builds trust, we can sell something. For concierge MVPs, we want the product we sell to have a lightning fast feedback loop so that we can iterate on it. This often means we need to solve a subset of the bigger problem you'll eventually solve, or what we call a wedge. Something that's painful and urgent and expensive and growing, but confined. Something we can handle. For our doctor friend, the long-term vision is to help doctors build out a comprehensive productivity system that minimizes portal interaction while still providing excellent care. That's a mouthful and a huge promise. Too big for a concierge MVP. You'll need to balance the big long-term vision for your customer with short, achievable, believable wins. Often, wedges just come directly from our customers. In this case, it came from our champion. When I asked our doctor friend what a wedge might be, he reached out to James again, his Frank, to hear more about how he'd tried to improve his productivity in the past. James said the big struggle was always sticking to the plan. He'd create time blocks and create boundaries, but they'd always get broken by something unpredictable. Hospitals are a tough place to plan ahead, he said. He really wanted an expert who could help him stick to his plan. So, after a bunch of deliberation, our entrepreneur doctor landed on a 3-day workshop as their wedge product. Day 1 would be an hour-long session teaching participants how to track their time so that they could do a full audit on it. Day 2, a week later, would help them implement a system based on that audit to batch and time block with rules and contingencies. Day 3, a week after that, would be a recalibration of the system after a doctor had tried their program for a week and noticed things that didn't work. The promise was 3 weeks to shave 5 hours of portal time off your week. It cost $1,000 and, at the suggestion of James again, had a form to submit this to the hospital to pay for as part of their continuing education credits. This was then put on the landing page with a date, just 10 days away, for the start of the first session. The button that said buy automatically populated an email to our doctor that said in the body, quote, "I'm interested in the productivity workshop," and noted that payment would be collected prior to the first session. Our doctor emailed the landing page to the 10 doctors he thought were good leads, then ended up sending it to a group of 25 other doctor friends and asked them to forward to anyone else they thought might be interested. After he sent it out, he sent me an email saying he was absolutely, quote, terrified. Here's another quote from that email. "What if no one signs up? What if $1,000 was too much? What if I can't actually save people any time? Why did I do this? What was I thinking?" There was a laughing face emoji at the end, but I didn't buy it. He was stressed, which means he's on the right track. The last 15% is hard. That's exactly why most people avoid it, and exactly why you shouldn't. We'll talk through the details of the Concierge MVP and how it went, if anyone signed up, if anyone paid, if he was able to deliver the value, if that smile emoji was right and this whole thing was a mistake, and if Point Break or Top Gun is a better movie, next week on Idea to Startup. In the meantime, start thinking up Concierge MVP ideas and email them to me. Maybe we'll talk through one or two of them on the pod. This was the Idea to Startup podcast brought to you by Tacklebox. If you've got a startup idea and a full-time job, head to gettacklebox.com and either apply or join our self-paced program today. No application necessary. And get serious with your startup idea. Have a great week.